At 2:47 a.m. on a cold Tuesday night in Denver, Colorado, 14-year-old Marcus Thompson's fingers trembled as he typed what he thought might be his last message. His stepfather had returned home drunk again, but this time something was different. The usual shouting had escalated into something far more dangerous. And when Marcus tried to intervene to protect his younger sister, he found himself locked in the basement storage room. The concrete walls seemed to close in around him as he heard his sister crying upstairs. His phone had only 12% battery left, and he'd already tried calling 911 twice, but the signal was weak in the basement. Desperation drove him to open his contacts, scrolling through names of friends who were probably asleep, teachers who wouldn't see the message until morning, and then he saw it. Jake Morrison, a family friend who rode with the local Bandidos MC chapter. Marcus had met Jake only twice at neighborhood barbecues, but something about the leather-clad biker had always made him feel safe. Jake had this way of talking to kids like they mattered, like their problems were real and important. Now, with his world falling apart above him, Marcus typed the most important message of his young life. "Jake, it's Marcus from Elm Street. He locked me in the basement. My sister is upstairs crying. I can hear him yelling. Please help us. I'm scared." The message showed as delivered at 2:49 a.m. Marcus stared at his phone screen, watching the battery percentage drop to 11%, then 10%. He had no way of knowing that his desperate plea for help had just set in motion a chain of events that would not only save his family that night, but inspire an entire community to stand up for those who couldn't protect themselves. If stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe in standing up for others. Because sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly what the world needs. Jake Morrison was working late in his garage, rebuilding the engine of his 1998 Harley Softail, when his phone buzzed against the workbench. As the road captain for the Denver chapter of Bandidos MC, he was used to late-night calls, brothers needing bail money, family emergencies, or club business that couldn't wait until morning. But when he read Marcus's message, something cold settled in his stomach. Without hesitation, Jake dialed the boy's number, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried twice more with the same result. The address was burned into his memory from those neighborhood gatherings. 1247 Elm Street, just 15 minutes away on his bike. Jake had noticed things during those barbecues, the way Marcus's stepfather drank too much, how the kids seemed to shrink when the man raised his voice, but he'd hoped he was reading too much into it. Jake's fingers moved quickly across his phone screen, sending a group message to his chapter brothers. Code yellow. Domestic situation. Kids in danger. 1247 Elm Street. Rolling now. Need backup. Within seconds, his phone exploded with responses. On my way, from Tommy Rodriguez. 5 minutes out, from Big Mike Sullivan. Already on the road, from Danny Chen. This was what the brotherhood meant. When one person needed help, especially a kid, nothing else mattered. As Jake fired up his Harley and roared into the night, he wasn't thinking about the legal implications or potential consequences. He was thinking about a scared 14-year-old boy locked in a basement, reaching out to the only person he thought might help. The rumble of his engine echoed through the quiet residential streets, soon joined by the distinctive sound of more motorcycles converging from different directions. The cavalry was coming, and they wore leather jackets instead of uniforms, but their mission was the same as any first responder: protect those who couldn't protect themselves. By 3:15 a.m., 7 motorcycles were parked outside the modest 2-story house on Elm Street. The Bandidos had arrived in waves, first Jake, then Tommy and Big Mike, followed by Danny, Carlos, Frank, and Razor. They could hear the commotion from the street, a man's angry voice, a child crying, and the sound of something being thrown against a wall. Jake motioned for silence as they approached the front door, their boots heavy on the wooden porch steps. Jake knocked first, 3 firm, measured raps that carried authority but not aggression. "Mr. Henderson, this is Jake Morrison. We need to talk." The shouting inside stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. After 30 seconds with no response, Jake knocked again, louder this time. "Sir, we know Marcus and his sister are in there. We just want to make sure everyone's okay." Still nothing. The bikers exchanged glances, each one reading the same determination in the other's eyes. "Marcus texted me for help," Jake called out, his voice carrying the weight of absolute resolve. "We're not leaving until we know those kids are safe." From somewhere inside the house, they heard a door slam, followed by rapid footsteps. Big Mike, a former Marine who stood 6'4" and weighed 260, stepped forward. "Jake, that boy's been locked up for over 30 minutes. His phone's probably dead by now." The front door suddenly swung open, revealing a disheveled man in his 40s, reeking of alcohol and barely able to stand straight. "Get off my property," Henderson slurred, trying to project authority he didn't possess. "This is none of your business." Jake stepped forward, his presence calm but unmistakable. "Actually, sir, when a kid reaches out for help, it becomes everyone's business." "Where's Marcus?" Henderson's bravado crumbled as he looked at the 7 leather-clad men standing on his porch, their faces showing a mixture of controlled anger and unwavering determination. He knew he was outnumbered, outmatched, and most importantly, completely in the wrong. What happened next would be talked about in the neighborhood for years to come. Henderson, swaying slightly from the alcohol, made the mistake of trying to slam the door shut. Big Mike's massive hand caught it effortlessly, and Jake stepped into the doorway. "Sir, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, but those kids are coming with us tonight. Where's Marcus?" The man's face went pale as he realized these weren't just neighborhood troublemakers. These were men with a code, and he'd crossed a line they wouldn't tolerate. He's in the basement," Henderson mumbled, his earlier aggression completely deflated. "But he's fine. He needed to cool off." Tommy Rodriguez, himself a father of 3, stepped forward with barely contained rage. "You locked a 14-year-old boy in a basement. Where's the key?" Henderson fumbled in his pockets, his hand shaking as he produced a small silver key. Jake snatched it and headed for the basement door, followed by Danny and Carlos. The basement was dark and cold, with Marcus huddled in the corner of a storage room barely bigger than a closet. His phone was dead, clutched in his hands like a lifeline that had finally run out of power. When Jake's flashlight beam found him, the boy looked up with eyes that held both terror and desperate hope. "Jake, you came?" His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from calling for help that hadn't come until now. "Of course we came, kid," Jake said softly, kneeling down to Marcus's level. "Nobody gets left behind, especially not kids." "Are you hurt?" Marcus shook his head, but Jake could see the emotional damage written across his young face. As they helped him to his feet, they could hear his 8-year-old sister Emma crying upstairs, and Big Mike's gentle voice trying to comfort her. The rescue was just the beginning. Now came the harder part of making sure these children never had to live in fear again. Upstairs, the scene was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Emma Thompson sat on the living room couch, her small frame dwarfed by Big Mike's massive leather jacket that he'd wrapped around her shoulders. Razor, whose intimidating nickname belied his gentle nature with children, was showing her pictures on his phone of his own daughter's soccer team. The contrast was striking. These rough-looking bikers transformed into protective father figures in the presence of scared children. Jake emerged from the basement with Marcus, who immediately ran to his sister. The reunion was emotional, with both kids clinging to each other as if they'd been separated for months instead of hours. Henderson stood in the corner, sobering up quickly as the reality of his situation became clear. 7 witnesses, 2 traumatized children, and a phone full of evidence that would be hard to explain away to authorities. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. "The kids are coming with us tonight. Tomorrow we're calling Child Protective Services and making sure they get placed somewhere safe. You," he pointed at Henderson, "are going to get help for your drinking problem, or you're going to find yourself dealing with more than just us next time." Tommy had already called his wife Maria, who ran a licensed foster care home and had dealt with emergency placements before. "She's getting the spare room ready," he told Jake quietly. "Kids can stay as long as they need to." Carlos was documenting everything with his phone camera: the basement storage room, the overturned furniture upstairs, Henderson's condition. "Evidence," he explained simply, "in case we need it later." The transformation in Marcus was visible as he realized these men had literally answered his desperate call for help in the middle of the night, asking nothing in return except the chance to make sure he and his sister were safe. If you believe in protecting those who can't protect themselves, show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement helps stories like this reach people who need to hear them. Within an hour, the Thompson children were sitting in Tommy and Maria Rodriguez's warm kitchen, eating homemade cookies and hot chocolate, while Maria gathered spare clothes and toiletries. The Bandidos had followed them there, not ready to leave, until they were certain the kids felt safe and secure. Marcus kept looking around, as if he couldn't quite believe this was real, that his desperate text message had brought not just help, but a whole new support system. "You did the right thing reaching out," Jake told Marcus as they sat at the kitchen table. "It takes courage to ask for help, especially when you're scared. You protected your sister tonight by being brave enough to send that message." Emma had fallen asleep in Big Mike's arms, her small hand still clutching the corner of his jacket. The sight of this intimidating biker gently rocking a sleeping child spoke volumes about the true nature of brotherhood. Maria Rodriguez had seen dozens of emergency placements over her 15 years as a foster parent, but she'd never seen anything like this. "Usually kids come to us through official channels, social workers, court orders," she explained to her husband later. But these children came surrounded by guardian angels wearing leather jackets. The next morning, she would call CPS herself, but tonight was about healing and helping two traumatized kids feel safe again. As the bikers prepared to leave, Marcus approached Jake with something he'd been thinking about all night. "Why did you come? I mean, you barely know me. You could have just ignored the text or called the police instead." Jake knelt down to the boy's level, the same way he had in that dark basement. "Because everyone deserves someone who will show up when they call for help, and because that's what family does." The word family hung in the air with new meaning. Not just blood relatives, but people who choose to stand up for each other when it matters most. Word of the midnight rescue spread through the Denver community like wildfire. Within a week, the local news had picked up the story, though they focused more on the unusual nature of a motorcycle club's intervention than the deeper message about community responsibility. But for those who knew the real story, something profound had shifted in their understanding of what it meant to look out for each other. Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door to the Henderson house, admitted to reporters that she'd heard the disturbances many times, but had never called for help. "I thought it wasn't my business," she said, tears in her eyes. "But after seeing what those bikers did, I realize we all have a responsibility to protect children in our community." She wasn't alone in this revelation. Several neighbors came forward to say they'd noticed warning signs, but had chosen to look the other way. The Bandidos chapter didn't seek publicity for their actions, but they couldn't stop the wave of positive change their intervention had sparked. 3 other families in the neighborhood reached out to social services about concerning situations they'd witnessed. The local elementary school started a program teaching children about trusted adults they could contact in emergencies. Even the police department acknowledged that sometimes help comes from unexpected sources. Marcus and Emma thrived in the Rodriguez household, with Marcus telling anyone who would listen about the night 7 bikers answered his call for help. His grades improved, Emma started smiling again, and both children began to understand that not all adults would let them down. The legal proceedings against Henderson moved forward, but more importantly, the kids were building new foundations of trust and security. Jake Morrison continued his regular visits, not as a hero seeking recognition, but as someone who understood that real protection meant ongoing commitment, not just dramatic one-time rescues. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood before a room full of community leaders, social workers, and yes, several members of the Bandidos MC, sharing his story at a conference on child protection. His voice was steady now, confident in a way that would have been impossible before that desperate night. "Sometimes help comes from places you don't expect," he told the audience, "but it only comes when someone is brave enough to ask, and when others are willing to answer." The Henderson case had resulted in mandatory counseling and supervised visitation rights, but more importantly, it had sparked a community-wide conversation about responsibility and intervention. The Bandidos chapter had quietly established a 24-hour helpline for kids in crisis. staffed by members who understood that their intimidating appearance could be exactly what was needed to stop dangerous situations. Emma, now 9, had drawn a picture that hung in the Rodriguez family kitchen: 7 motorcycles surrounding a house, with stick figures of children being led to safety. When visitors asked about it, she would explain matter-of-factly that these are my guardian angels and they wear leather jackets. Her simple faith in the goodness of people who had shown up in her darkest hour had become a source of inspiration for everyone who met her. Jake Morrison still worked late in his garage, still responded to late-night calls from his brothers, but now his phone also carried messages from other kids in the community who had learned that asking for help was a sign of strength, not weakness. The Brotherhood had expanded beyond the motorcycle club to include teachers, neighbors, social workers, and anyone else willing to stand up for those who couldn't protect themselves. The real victory wasn't just in saving 2 children from one terrible night, but in creating a network of people committed to making sure no child would ever have to face their fears alone again. Because that's what real brotherhood looks like: showing up when it matters, asking nothing in return except the chance to make the world a little safer for those who need protection most. If this story inspired you to be someone's guardian angel, share it in the comments below and tell us about a time when someone showed up for you when you needed it most.